Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here as we roll into week 2 of our 5-week course. Hard to believe. Last week was, I guess it was a shortened week somewhat, but yeah, if you blinked, you missed it, right? So that was week 1, and we've moved through, almost moved through a couple of different units now, which we'll take a look at. So this is a more typical video announcement for me. So we're going to look at our course a little bit. Look at some things that are going on right now and kind of look forward to our first workshop coming up, which is important to keep in the back of your mind. So even as we work through kind of like our current units, it's good to be aware of where that next workshop is going to fall. I'll look at that in just a second here. So many of you have signed up for this text message reminder thing. If you haven't, I'd really recommend you do so. You don't have to download an app or do really anything, but it allows me to send out text messages to the whole class, not individually, with reminders about, typically just about due dates. So I send those out via our email, which will go to your COD student account. That's just like a default in Blackboard. I can't change that. But I also send out those same things via text message, which for a lot of people is much more convenient. You get it, like on your phone more or less immediately. And it's pretty simple. I don't know your phone number. You don't know mine. It's pretty simple. Anyway, it's hanging here in our announcements if you want to find it and take care of that. And if you have troubles, let me know. Sometimes the short code thing doesn't work on certain kinds of phones. Okay, anyway, back to our due dates then. So I'm recording this on Monday morning. We have 2 units due at the same time. We moved pretty quickly, like I said earlier, in advance of our first workshop, which is the fiction workshop, so you're writing a short story, which is coming up due for us on Friday, which again really isn't a lot of time, but to compress all of the genres we want to cover in, we have to move sometimes, like for units 2 and 3, a little more quickly. And what you'll notice is that this Unit 5 kind of becomes the anchor point, our first workshop, where beyond our initial introductions, everything kind of then builds up to this kind of writing. So Unit 2 had us thinking about this idea of what it means to be working like a writer and making sure you're making time to write on a regular basis. Like I've said before, it's just a truism that a class like this is beneficial, sometimes just because it like forces you to get some writing done. So those due dates are pretty handy, right? They don't always feel that way, trust me, I know, but it at least gets you kind of motivated to do the writing that you want to be doing. And then there's a framing memory discussion, or a assignment. It's built as a discussion board. And so you're kind of writing a miniature short story. It just happens to be based on something that actually happened to you. And so this is a good sort of first occasion to think about writing for an audience, because obviously the memory is going to be important to you. That's why you choose it. But then how do you frame it? How do you make it interesting to somebody else? There has to be more than just the facts of the event. Like you can't just make a list of this happened, this happened, this happened. There has to be more going on. It has to be told in a certain way using certain evocative language. And it's funny how really, without a lot of prompting from me or from a textbook or anything like that, people sort of know how to tell a good story. It's funny how much we know about writing, or at least storytelling, without even really being taught it exactly, or we know it without knowing that we know it. It sounds awful to say, but hopefully you get the idea. Unit number 3 has us looking at this fun exercise using language. One of the maybe the most fundamental building blocks is what's called analogic language, or language of analogy. So simile, metaphor, anything that's comparison based. And one of the things that you can notice is how oftentimes an assignment like this one, framing the memory, to make memory interesting, to make a story interesting, we don't just have to have interesting events. It doesn't have to just be plot driven or really dramatic, over the top, like sci-fi or fantasy, or everybody dies at the end or something kind of grandiose like that. Often it's the way that we tell that story in terms of language. So we make interesting comparisons, we use interesting descriptive phrases, so it's on the level of the language that a story can be interesting too, not just in terms of like plot or, again, those over-the-top sorts of things that might be happening. You'll notice that one of the, or actually many of the rules of creative writing sort of speak to this, this idea of scope. So when you sit down to write, it doesn't have to be a zombie story. People don't have to die. Things don't have to explode. In fact, one of the challenges that I'll put forth to you is if you kind of gravitate to those things, is there still a story there if you took those elements away? Again, lots of like popular, first it was vampires for a while, now we're kind of in a zombie undead phase. There's lots of TV and movie stuff about that, so people kind of gravitate to that as a kind of story to tell, which there's nothing wrong with that per se, but if I pulled those elements out, is there still an interesting story there? And if there's not, then you've just kind of dressed up a boring story with like weird elements like zombies or whatever it happens to be. So you'll notice again that there always needs to be that level of language working, which is really what Unit 3 has us thinking about. Unit 4 then is one of my favorite in our course. It's a really fun assignment that I'm going to pop us into here. So that one's due Wednesday. So there's a brief section, again, a reading, a theory of short stories, which is just that, a theory. It works differently in practice, this idea of kind of rising action, a major event, whatever you want to call it, the turning point, the crisis, that moment, and then falling action. So a very simplistic kind of visual way of thinking about that. But of course, you know, this turning point doesn't happen like exactly halfway through every story. In fact, sometimes it happens at the very beginning and everything else kind of explains the fallout from that. In other cases, it might happen at the very end. So there really is no kind of like resolution. We're left hanging a little bit. And each of those story designs can certainly work. Really what you want to think about is, does your story have some form of each of these component pieces? One of my least favorite movies of all time, but one of my favorite as a narrative example, is Pacific Rim. Look it up if you've never heard of it before. It's horrible. I mean, it's every cliche rolled into one, and I think they're making another one. I don't know. Anyway, if you were to map out the kind of rising action, turning point or climax, and falling action, there'd be nothing. It just is a flat line from start to finish. It's like a quintessential action, over-the-top action movie. There's really no development. It's just like, here's this really flimsy premise for the plot of what's going to happen. There's aliens, there's robots, there's things blowing up, and it's just flat out action, which is maybe the best kind of action movie. I don't know. But it's a terrible story, and it's really an awful movie. It's hard to watch. So it becomes good to watch because it's hard to watch. It's like one of those movies. Anyway, so very theoretical kinds of stuff here. Easy to look at when it's just a nice little triangle. Much harder when you need to actually put it into practice. So the next piece of the unit then actually assigns a couple of stories to read. There's one from our book, and then another one that is built in as an e-text in our book, and the link is here if the e-book doesn't show right up. It's Sherwood Anderson's Hands, and as is often the case, we read here not to see how what a perfect story looks like necessarily, but to think about how each of these works manages like the idea of rising action, the sort of climactic moment, and then resolution or not resolution or falling action. So these aren't necessarily held up as the golden standard, but it's important to look at professionally produced and published work as a way of learning some of the strategies that that certain writers, you know, employ when they craft a narrative, when they tell a story. Okay, and then so your job for this unit then, once we get into this last folder here, is to write a significant object piece, and it's actually better explained down here. Oh, I hate it when these things happen. You sometimes have to modify how your browser shows content to get this little audio program to show up. So there was a book called Significant Objects, and the premise of the book was to take tchotchkes, these little like doohickey kinds of things that were more or less valueless, and then hire or have writers write a backstory, totally fictitious, of course, but make up a story that imbued that object with value. The idea being like, could the story part of that object actually become a value-making kind of a thing? It's great, like, to think about as a writer, the value of the story. And then they would sell them on eBay, sometimes for like $100, sometimes for $1, but other times it made like significant money. Now there's lots of reasons for that, like maybe a famous author wrote it. And of course it was all above board. The sellers of these things were very explicit about, okay, we are telling a totally made-up story about this thing, it's part of a book project, etc., etc. So there's lots of, things going on in this little experiment. But I still think it's a fun way of thinking about the value of telling a story. There's a link to the website, the book website itself, a couple of, or at least one example specifically that I'm pointing you to. So it's really, really important, as everywhere in our story, to make sure you read through the assignment here, listen to the story, look at the examples, read through at least this example, if not more, to understand what it is we're trying to do before you launch into the assignment, which is basically asking you to create a backstory for a tchotchke you can find, this little thing. Again, find the thing itself. Don't just Google tchotchke to find an image, since an image is part of what you're posting. And then the assignment itself, right, is to write a story, a very short one, which forces us to be very picky about details, to build kind of like a less is more approach. Don't tell a real story about how your grandmother owned the thing and because you love your grandmother. Now it's important, remember, this is almost as if you were going to sell it on eBay, so it needs to have a story that's like intrinsically interesting, or a backstory that's intrinsically interesting, not just that this is important to you and therefore somebody else should pay $5 or $50 or $100 for it. Again, this idea will come through clearly really more in the examples than in just the theoretical discussion here. And then respond to 2 other student posts once those are up there. It's really fun to read others' writing, provide like positive feedback, and be sure you get that image in there. Don't just Google it, but find an actual object that you own and then take a picture or 2 of it. It's pretty wild when you start looking around your house or your apartment or your garage and discover the various things that you own. It's you start to wonder about yourself. You really do. Anyway, all a really fun kind of assignment. I have no idea where this one's from. I have no idea. He looked pretty happy though, which is, exciting. This, though, all kind of leads us up to Unit 5, our first workshop. Now, truthfully, the assignment is just to write a short story. There's a basic word count here, but there's no style it has to be in. It doesn't have to be quote-unquote literary, whatever that would even mean. There has to be evidence that you've invested some time in it, but clearly you're posting it for workshop to get feedback, so, it's going to have mistakes. It's going to have places that are weaker than other places. We know that going in. Remember, you're not graded really on the so-called quality of the writing. You're graded more on the effort you've invested in posting on time, making sure the file is accessible, following directions, and then primarily the degree or the quality of the feedback you give to your group members. So I've assembled the groups, and because we have a very quick turnaround between when the short stories are posted in the discussion board, so you're just going to click in, find your group, and then do a reply. You'll notice that I've started all the posts, so that's how you'll get things going. And then post your story. You can write a little note if you want about, this is about my, first car, or I'm interested in feedback on character, or this was really hard for me to write, or easy, or whatever. But mostly you're just attaching the file. And then, so you'll notice if we look at the due dates here, and you don't get sick as I scroll quickly through our course, that there's 2 for each workshop. So the first one, you're posting your work by the end of the day on Friday, hopefully earlier if possible. But notice that means that you're probably working on this short story as you're doing these other units as well. It's going to be hard to start from scratch after you've finished Unit 4 here and then produce a short story. So you probably want to get that underway now. Again, 5-week compressed format, we just move pretty quickly. And then you're providing feedback to everybody in your group who's posted on time by that Monday. So you'll have the weekend, but also primarily that Monday to read the stories and provide comments, and then post the file back to the same discussion board. I've kept the group small because of that quick turnaround, and now it's really important, or especially as we get closer to Unit 5, to make sure that you review how the workshops work. So you get how the grading works, the posting works, you'll understand how you're attaching your file, lots of squiggly writing that I've done here, and then the how to provide feedback, one of the most important parts of our course. You can use the comment feature in Word or whatever word processor you use. You can highlight, you can add stuff in square brackets, but make sure that that's easily findable by the person who's reading the file, who gets it back, the author. So you're not just providing some like little paragraph at the end of it all. You're not providing just a paragraph in the discussion board. You're actually marking up the document throughout. Not just fixing typos either, but really like responding to what's positive, what's negative, and why are things working? Is it descriptive words that are working? Is there something that's causing confusion, right? You're really being like intrusive in that document. And again, if you're kind of not so confident about how that's going to work, there's lots of instructions here about ways you can start to formulate responses. So not just I liked it, I didn't like it, but that next step of like why. Be as specific as possible. And again, the grading is largely about did you post on time and did you provide meaningful feedback. Very little has to do with is your short story, perfect. Nobody expects that it would be. Okay, so that's a lot to think about here as we move quickly through our course. But again, I'm asking you to, as we do units 2, 3, and now 4, to actually be looking ahead to Unit 5, because you're posting your own short story, but also preparing to provide feedback to others who are in your group. So as always, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and I look forward to reading everybody's significant object story.